In a previous video, we talked about subclasses. The idea is a motivating example. We had this PowerPoint program, and we wanted to draw objects that were on a slide, things like text boxes and images. We started off with an original class called slide content, and the idea was this class contained all of the features that these objects needed to have in common. And then for specialized features, like say text, well, I would make a different class called text box. But if you look inside of the parentheses, you notice the word slide content here. Well, that means that textbox is a subclass of slide content. Any object that is a textbox object has access not only to the textbox methods, but also to the methods in slide content as well. In this video, I want to talk about visualizing this subclass relationship, because we have to visualize things before we understand, well, how to execute the code in a subclass. Now, normally when I say visualizing, I say it's time to go to the Python tutor. But not so much this time. Because one of the things you might have noticed is that the way that we draw class folders in this course is slightly different than the way the Python tutor draws it. In fact, okay, let's go to the Python tutor, but only to emphasize how different they are. So let's remind ourselves about this simple example class that we saw in a previous video series. If I were to hit visualize in the Python tutor right now, what would it do? Well, it would create a global variable, for example. It would create an empty folder for the class, and it would put the ID of that folder inside of the global variable. But that's not actually how we've been drawing them. We've been drawing them like above my head right now. You notice a couple of things about this folder. So first of all, we've always been putting the tab of the folder to the left. That's to emphasize that this is a class folder and not an object folder. We also haven't been putting the ID in that tab. Instead, we've just been putting, well, the name of the class, essentially that global variable. Why have we been doing this? Okay, first of all, we don't care about the ID. The only reason we cared about the ID for objects is because, well, there can be more than one object of a class. There can be more than one point. There can be more than one RGB color. But for any class, like say example, well, there's only one example class. Because if I were to make another example class, well, I would be replacing the original example class that I have. So I still only have one. So that's why we don't care about the IDs. We really just care about the name of the class. So we ignore the global variable and we just put the class name in the folder tab. But that's not the only reason why we draw the class folders this way. Now let's go talk about subclasses. So once again, I'm looking at the Python tutor, but I'm just looking at it to show how different the Python tutor is from what we're going to be doing in our visualizations. So I've got my two classes here. Well, these are stubs, right? There's no real code here, but that's okay. These stubs are enough to create the class folders, and that's all I actually need here. So I'm going to go visualize this. I am going to create the slide content class, and I'm going to create the text box class. And you'll notice that it did the usual thing, right? It created the class folder for each. It put the ID inside of slide content and inside of text box. But there's one thing that I'm not actually seeing here. I'm not actually seeing the relationship between the text box and the slide content. I mean, it's here. You have to hunt for it. If you look at this, you'll notice right here, it says extend slide content. This is perhaps the most important thing in the picture here. So when we visualize, we want to emphasize that. So we're going to draw it like above my head. The idea is that we're going to draw a class folder for, say, slide content. And also remember that our class folders are much, much more simplified. I'm only drawing the method headers and their parameters inside of the class folder. And then for text box, well, I'm going to do the same thing, but this time in that tab, I'm not just going to write the word text box. I'm also going to write text box and then in the parentheses, slide content as well. And that's because I'm emphasizing that relationship. In fact, I want to emphasize that relationship so much that I want to additionally draw an arrow between the two class folders. You know, just like when I hover over these little variables right here inside the Python tutor, I get arrows. I really wish that the Python tutor would give me an arrow when I hovered over this extends right here, because that arrow relationship is so, so important. And it's going to be key to helping us visualize the execution of methods inside of a subclass. Now, if we look at this arrow picture above my head, it sort of raises, some interesting questions of, what exactly do I mean by the relationship between these two classes? I mean, I understand that the text box is what we would call the subclass, but what do we call the slide content then? I mean, I've been calling it the original class, but nobody actually uses that term. What terms do they use? Well, if TextBox is the subclass, we might say that slide content is the superclass. Though that sounds really fancy, and not many people actually use that term. Instead, once again, look at the picture of my head. You notice this arrow from TextBox to slide content? Well, that kind of looks like a family tree, right? It looks like there's sort of like a child-parent relationship there. Oh, and indeed, those are terms that we actually use here. We say that the slide content is the parent class and that the text box is the child class. That's not the only terms we use. There's one more term. Sometimes we say that the slide content is the base class, and then we say that the text box is the derived class. And the idea is that text box has everything that the slide content does, and, well, it has some more because it's derived from the slide content. Yeah, okay, so we have all of this terminology, but it gets even more interesting than that. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to draw the picture of my head. In practice, we actually mix metaphors. The most common terms to use are subclass, but to refer to the slide content as the parent, emphasizing that arrow that we actually use. But, okay, with that said, understand that I will sometimes go back and forth between all of these terms. So you just need to keep it straight, right? That we're only talking about two things, right? We're talking about this original class or base class, and then we're talking about the subclass. And all of these concepts like subclass, derived class, or child class, and similarly, superclass, parent class, or base class, all of these things are synonyms. And as long as you understand that, you will have no problem following what I'm going to say throughout the rest of the video series.